Howdy. We're moving on to chapter 20, and this is on risk management. I teach a course on this. In the fall of 2018, it will be online. This is a tough topic, risk management. If we were in class right now, I would ask you to raise your hand if you considered yourself an expert in risk. And typically, no one raises their hand. And then I always say, well, gee, I'm looking at a classroom full of people, and you've survived to be a certain age, 20, 22, 30, whatever. Raise your hand if you drove to school. Most people raise their hand. Raise your hand if you didn't wear a seatbelt, if you drove drunk, if you drove backwards, if you drove 120 miles an hour. And you laugh. I once had an employee who drove over 100 miles an hour, was caught, and tried to go to the judge with graphs and pictures as to why that was a safe speed at that particular area. Does not work in Cut and Shoot, Texas. But we are all, in fact, my point being, we are all, in fact, experts at managing risk. We would not survive to where we are. We look both ways when we cross the street. We eat healthy or we don't eat healthy. We go to the gym. We get vaccinations. All of this is about assessing and managing risk. So my point in saying this to you is you are all experts at managing risk. You would not be where you are today, even studying whatever field of study you're in. You did some thinking. Why didn't I just quit and go get a job as a unskilled laborer? Or why is it worth my time going to college, maybe incurring student debt? So don't overlook the fact that a lot of what you already know about risk, you've put in practice. So let's go to our first video. Of course, we have our attribution slide as always. So I want you to learn a little bit about risk and talk about risk mitigation strategies. Let's step back a minute. Risk, there's 4 ways I assess that risk can be assessed and managed. You can avoid risk, you can accept risk, you can mitigate risk, and you can transfer risk. So you can avoid risk saying, I don't like to fly, I'm scared of flying, I'm scared of dying in a plane crash, so I am not going to fly. I'm avoiding the risk. You can accept risk saying, I'm afraid to fly, but I will fly, but I'll wear my seatbelt, and I'll only fly safe airlines, and I will be cautious in case there's an emergency landing, whatever. You can transfer risk by buying insurance, right? Those of us who drive cars, we're required to have insurance, but we obey the speed limit. We wear our seatbelts, we buy a car that has a good safety record, but we still transfer that risk. And some people would say share the risk, but let's say transfer that risk as the classic term, by having insurance. And we can mitigate that risk. So accept, avoid, mitigate, transfer. That's it. Now we're going to describe risk models. This is really tough in cybersecurity. And I'll explain why. A lot of the risk models are based on financials. So how much is this going to cost? What's the best trade-off? We can't have 100% security. How do we spend the money we can't allocate? The big problem with all that is we don't have a good way to do economic modeling for cybersecurity attacks. You have to be able, your model is only as good as the data. How do I estimate the cost of bad decisions in protecting my intellectual property and my company goes bankrupt? Or in having my customers' files, data files that includes their consumer credit card numbers and the like stolen, and how do I assess the cost of reputation damage? I can assess the cost of replacing the cards, of paying for credit monitoring, but how do we assess the cost of these intangibles? And this is a great area right now because we don't know how to do it. Qualitative risk and quantitative risk. Quantitative means I give you a number. Qualitative means I give you something like, you'll hear me say, data criticality, low, moderate, or high. I'm not going to say, oh, this data is 25.5% critical, this is 39.6% and the like. Qualitative, is it low criticality, moderate or medium, or high? We'll talk about some tools and best practices. So I'm going to go through these quickly because I don't like a lot of these terms, but I just wanted to include them. ALE is your annualized loss expectancy. It's what the event's going to expect to cost the business in a year, but like I said, we're finding out these models don't work. The annualized rate of occurrence is a frequency within an event is expected to occur. Again, well, here's the problem with that. You can have one cybersecurity attack that wipes you out. ALE and ARO is great if you're talking about something like a physical. You know, I'm wondering how many power outages I'm going to have, and I have 2 typically a year, and this is how much it's going to cost me to recover. But when you're talking about a cyber attack, they don't work as well. Excuse me. Asset. Resources and information an organization needs to conduct its business. That's a classic definition from the book. I say anything of value to the organization. So when we talk about a vulnerability in an asset, we can talk about a vulnerability in a piece of equipment, in a piece of software, in a process, in a person, in a physical, whatever. Value to the organization, both physical and virtual. Availability, we've talked about, it's part of the CIA. It applies to hardware, software, data, specifically meaning which of those should be present and accessible. Control is a big word, a measure taken to detect, prevent, or mitigate the risk associated with a threat. So when you take risk assessment, I think some of my students are disappointed that we spend so much time looking at the NIST controls and discussing the NIST controls and how to implement them, but that's because that's a measure taken to detect, prevent, or mitigate the risk. So you put into effect personal security measures, you put into effect physical and environmental measures, you put into protect media protection, incident response, and the like. Countermeasure is a synonym for control, but I prefer the term control because it is a NIST term. Exposure factors measure the magnitude of a loss of an asset. Again, it's used in the calculation of the SLE, not important. You need to know asset, availability, control, okay? Hazard is a situation that increases the risk. Impact, big term, the result of a vulnerability being exploited by a threat resulting in a loss. Classic definition. You have a vulnerability as a weakness in an asset. If it can be exploited by a threat, if that actually occurs, then we have an impact. And again, trying to assess these impacts can be difficult. And an intangible impact is an impact in which a monetary equivalent is difficult or impossible to determine. So, as I said, damages to brand recognition, loss of reputation, loss of goodwill, the like. Now, these others, mean time between failure, mean time to failure, mean time to repair, are just that. How long is it between failures? How long is it going to take to get to the next failure? How long is it going to be to repair? These are classic terms. If you're dealing more with physical assets, I can do some pretty good predictive models on how something needs to be available, reliable, maintainable, and the like. Again, I'm glossing over those terms in this chapter. So mitigate, how do we reduce the likelihood of a threat? Qualitative and quantitative, I've talked about. It's subjectively determining the impact of an event is qualitative. Quantitative is objectively not important. I think of it as a number, qualitative as a class. Residual risk is the risk that remains after we do risk management. So we're always going to have risk. There will always, always, always be risk. Risk analysis and risk assessment, I kind of lump together. Analysis meaning analyze the environment to identify the threats, vulnerabilities, mitigating actors, So the assessment is that process of analyzing an environment to identify those using the analysis, and then risk management is that overall process. You've identified it, you've determined the cost, and you've decided what actions you're going to take. Again, I'm glossing over the rest of these. They're in your book. Safeguards, a control, I've already said, use the word control, single loss expectancy, monetary loss or impact, systematic and unsystematic risk. a form of risk can be managed by diversification. Systematic risk, I know there's a risk there. Tangible impact, it's going to be financial loss, physical damage. I can measure it. I cannot measure if someone says your reputation is ruined. And a threat is a circumstance or event with the potential to cause harm to an asset. We'll end these up. Threat vector, the method by which a threat actor introduces a specific threat. Unsystematic risk is the risk that cannot be mitigated by diversification. And they can result in all types of risk controls. If we were studying risk, we'd spend more time on this. We're not going to. But vulnerability is a weakness in the asset that can be exploited by a threat to cause harm. So it's an essential element of management. It's one of the top 5 that's come out in the NIST, National Initiative on Cybersecurity Education. We need to teach more about risk. This risk management, it's not only essential, it's why people don't like to do risk assessment and risk management is it just seems too non-technical. It seems like so many times you're making decisions or analyzing situations, and it can get overly complicated and complex. So it's basically all those actions taken to reduce complexity, increase objectivity. It's a skill and a task. Every manager at all levels, this bullet says, must learn to manage risk. Every cybersecurity worker, every person that's not a cybersecurity worker, if you're putting your hand on a keyboard in any way, you've got to learn to manage risk, assess and manage risk. So I'm not going to spend time on these slides. I'm keeping them there for historical value. I want you to hone in on the concepts and terminology. Risk is the possibility of suffering harm and loss, and risk management is a decision-making process. And risk assessment or risk analysis analyzes the environment and determines mitigating actions to protect assets. Is any resource or information an organization needs to conduct its business? Resource or information, physical and virtual. Assets are something of value to the organization. And again, this can be a subjective call. Someone may not think some asset has that much value and tend to overlook it, when in fact that could be the entry point for an attack. We've talked about these, so I'm just going to go through this because this is going to be a long chapter, and I don't want people falling asleep. So we're going to impact, control, we've talked about, qualitative, mitigate, reduce the likelihood of a threat occurring. Again, I'm not highlighting these particular definitions in this class, or systematic and unsystematic, just because that gets to be confusing. For instance, my house was flooded in Hurricane Harvey last August, and I lost my car in Houston. Now, it's a systematic risk. There was a hurricane. We understand that that's predictable to have a house flood in a hurricane. However, I was not adequately prepared for the flood, and I should say there was no way I could adequately prepare for the flood. I had black tape on my doors in case the water started seeping in. Well, when the water's coming through the walls, up through the floor, in through the garage, that black tape's almost a joke. But it was a foreseeable event. It was systematic. You have a hurricane in Houston, you have a history of floods, your house can flood. So why wasn't I better prepared? Because I was relying on the fact that my house, built in 1958, that sits in front of a bayou, had never, ever, ever flooded. And quite frankly, I don't know what I could have done differently other than try to move all my furniture up to higher ground, right? So it's a systematic risk. We know it's predictable. That doesn't mean just because it's systematic, we can always manage it. Whereas an unsystematic, it's unpredictable in the aggregate because it results from forces that are difficult to predict. So for instance, I don't know, 15 years ago or something, there was a tsunami in the Pacific and over 100,000 people were killed. The right forces had to come together for the tsunami to occur. You could argue it was systematic, yeah, but the probability of that event was so small. It was a black swan event. A black swan event is an event that has a very small probability of occurring. But if it occurs, the consequences are just disastrous. So understand that systematic risk you can still have systematic risk, but just as my case, not be able to manage that risk effectively. I look back on Harvey, August 27th, there was nothing I could do differently. I was worried about losing power, so I had 1,000 flashlights and batteries and lanterns. I had water, I had food. Ironically, I never lost power. My house flooded, I never lost power. More ironically, is both of my kids live in Houston. They're adults, and their houses did not flood. However, they both lost power. So I don't want you to think unsystematic just means when something disastrous happens. It has to be kind of a so unpredictable forms, like the tsunami, like other things, like an earthquake. Yeah, we can predict there's going to be an earthquake, but we can't predict it with any accuracy as we can something like a hurricane. Okay, so again, we're going to talk about risk management. I want to go with the NIST definition. NIST is all-based risk management framework, is how we now assess controls. Carnegie Mellon's SEI. If you're not familiar with this, spend some time Googling it. I was surprised last spring when I brought this up in my class, and a lot of people majoring in computer science had never heard of SEI. They came up with a software capability maturity model, and we have copied that in cybersecurity for a security maturity model. I'm not going to worry about this so much. ISAC is a good organization if you're interested. They do a lot of free stuff. If you're a student, you can come down and do full-day seminars, and they'll usually comp you. And if you're a professional, it's only $35, and that basically pays for your lunch. Something you might want to put in your toolkit. But here's basically how we manage risk. We identify the risk to the best of our ability. Then we say, is this risk the responsibility of my organization? And if it's no, we delegate it, but that's a little risky in itself, because you got to make sure that even though it may not be the responsibility, it can have an impact on you. Then we do a business case analysis. Is it going to cost more than the impact? Yes, so we're going to accept it. No, we're going to figure something out. We're going to transfer it, or we're going to mitigate it. Here's the problem with that. Why did we not have chips on our credit cards in the United States for so many years? It's because at this step, the fact that the banks made a business decision, they looked into it, they analyzed the risk of data breaches and said, you know what, it's cheaper to recover from a data breach than it is to go through the infrastructure of developing chips on cards, changing the processing at the point of entry sales, sending out new credit cards. Oh, that's going to cost so much more money. And actually, that's so much more than the cost of a data breach. Until we had a tipping point with Target and Home Depot and these others, and the risk model changed, mostly because of the intangibles, so reputational cost. That changing the credit cards and the infrastructure stayed the same. So I'm going to close with this one. Good, because it's under 20 minutes. I'm trying to keep these videos shorter. You have to have a culture. You have to think about risk. You have to look at risk. Sometimes I drive people crazy. Ironically, I was in London last year, and on a Friday afternoon, I was walking with my friend in London and down these streets and these bridges right in the heart of London, and I pointed out to her what I considered some physical vulnerabilities, and the Ministry of Defense building that was not very well protected. The next evening, that same bridge, a car killed in a terrorist attack, I believe 6 or 8 individuals, right where I had said, I'm surprised there's no physical barriers here. I do tend to drive people crazy when you get in this, if you're in cybersecurity for a while, or worse, if you're a lawyer, and you begin to see risk everywhere. All right, that's the end of video 1. I'm getting ready to go with video 2. Thank you for your time.